One of the things that the arts are tremendously helpful with, and again, this is even if you want to ignore the question about the intrinsic value of the arts have tremendous instrumental value insofar as they remind us exactly why we struggle and suffer through these experiences in the first place.
Welcome to the Saginaw Art Museum podcast. COVID-19 pandemic is altering the usual routines of people around the globe and around the block. As practices of social distancing and self-quarantine are implemented, artists are finding new ways to adapt to the changing landscape. In this series, Art at Home, we have conversation with artists and creative-minded individuals to understand the way these unusual times are impacting lives. This episode, we have a little bit different perspective on the value of the arts. Today, we are talking with Peter Roseberry, Finkbeiner Endowed Professor of Ethics at Saginaw Valley State University. In our conversation today, Roseberry describes the value of the arts in the framework of the broader needs of our community during these challenging times. This interview was recorded April 23rd, 2020. Peter, you are a little bit different than the guests that we've had on the podcast in the past. We've been talking to a lot of artists and art-minded people, and you fall more in line with the art-minded people category here. But I thought that it would be interesting to hear your perspective on our current times and the impact that the arts have from ethics perspective. There are right now countless needs in our community, locally, regionally, nationally, and throughout the globe, really. And as an arts organization, we often make the case for art in our communities. And it's sometimes a little bit more challenging during a crisis like this to advocate for that in a way that's empathetic towards the other needs in our community. So I'm curious about the big question of the ethics behind supporting arts during a time of crisis.
I think that's a great question, Thor, and thank you for having this really important discussion. So let me introduce a little bit of philosophical terminology. As you say, I'm not an artist. I'm an ethist and a philosopher by training, but we all are in the humanities together. And so I think these disciplines actually cohabitate nicely. One distinction that ethicists like to make is a distinction between what we might call intrinsic value and instrumental value. Something's intrinsically valuable if it's valuable in and of itself, if it's valuable for its own sake, if it's valuable even if it's not useful. Something's instrumentally valuable just in case it is useful. So money is a good example of something that has instrumental value but not intrinsic value. It's not really valuable in and of itself, doesn't make your life go better just by having it, except insofar as it gets you other stuff that you want. Now, I think a lot of us who are either enmeshed in the arts community or sympathetic or simpatico with that community want to make the case that the arts have intrinsic value, that a world with aesthetic appreciation in it is better than a world that lacks it, that a human life that has aesthetic appreciation is better than a life that lacks it. I do think this is kind of a hard sell, and there are, in times like these, as you were pointing out, and there are still interesting questions about, well, even if it has intrinsic value, maybe there's other things that are even more valuable. So just to make things hard, let's just bracket talk about intrinsic value in the arts for the moment. I think there's still a really compelling case to be made that the arts have a tremendous amount of instrumental value, even if you don't want to talk about intrinsic value. And the idea is pretty simple. These are, for most of us, certainly for me, this is really unfamiliar territory. This is an unprecedented event, the pandemic that we are currently suffering and struggling through. And getting through is really, really, really difficult for a lot of us, even if you have, the other kinds of resources that we need to be safe and healthy in times like this. One of the things that the arts are tremendously helpful with, and again, this is even if you want to ignore the question about the intrinsic value of the arts. The arts have tremendous instrumental value insofar as they remind us exactly why we struggle and suffer through these experiences in the first place. There's all kinds of examples in music and in painting and in literature of people making sense and finding meaning during really, really perilous times. These are mechanisms that can inspire us, that can provide us comfort, that can provide us solace. But most importantly, they help us find meaning in life generally, but in very difficult circumstances in particular. In fact, when you start thinking about it, it's hard to think of a better example of a kind of tonic, of a kind of coping mechanism than the arts. Even people who are resorting to streaming, Netflix online or participating in social media, there's better and worse ways of doing that, and there's plenty of stuff out there that has aesthetic value that is being produced and sustained by the arts community. So even if we want to bracket really tough and interesting questions about art and aesthetics and intrinsic value, the arts are certainly useful to us insofar as they provide us hope, insofar as they provide us comfort, insofar as they provide us meaning. And insofar as we have any interest in trying to live a good life during a pandemic, which is not a lost cause, we really need to consider the role and value the arts insofar as insofar as the arts do provide those kinds of resources for us.
Yeah, that's a fantastic way of thinking and describing some of the value that the arts bring to the world generally, to our community specifically. One thing that we have talked about previously is sort of the way that there's been this outpouring of creative acts across disciplines when we see the way that people are able to work around situations. They're using a creative process that involves many times some artistic kind of element. For example, even on this call here, you and I are not face to face, but there's a way for us to communicate with one another because people had the forethought and the thought of creating a product to make it happen. You had mentioned sort of this balance between intrinsic and instrumental value and how the arts are bringing both of those things. Can you describe maybe a little bit more about how you see art continuing in this role into the future? And do you see any competition with other aspects of the community or industries that you feel may require more attention, or do you feel like the arts are incorporated into those more?
That's a tough question. I think they've got to be incorporated, partly because I think the arts have always been incorporated in any healthy, functioning society. Show me an example of a flourishing community that doesn't have some literary tradition, that doesn't have some music tradition, that doesn't have, some creation of artwork that we look back upon and think is important and think of as embodying what that particular society was about. It's odd. Sometimes people make the case, and you can see this in some of the Greek philosophers, for example, that we really only engage in art when we have leisure time. But that's not really clear, right? Art and artwork has always been something that human beings have participated in. Certainly, in modern developments, even during really, really difficult times. You find wartime literature, for example, that is of serious and great value. Some of the existentialist literature from the 20th century, like Camus' The Plague, came out of precisely, really, really difficult and challenging circumstances, probably wouldn't have been produced otherwise. So I don't know that there can actually be that much competition simply because history suggests to us that art and aesthetics are so ingrained not just within society and social arrangements generally, but so crucial to it during really difficult times. So the whole talk of competition, I'm worried, and I mean, it's a very real concern, and I'm sure that's why you're bringing it up. But the whole notion that the arts should somehow be in competition with other aspects of society is historically not been the case. And I think is in any case just a really bad idea. If for no other reason than you and I, am sure, and lots of other people listening think that the arts have this really central role to play in the good life. So I realize, we've only got the budget that we've got, that there's lots of other resources that require support and funding as well. But insofar as the arts are part of the good life, let's not make that a competition. Let's see if there's not a way that a rising tide can lift all boats.
That is a fantastic way of thinking and putting it into perspective. Your mention of associating art with leisure and how that isn't always necessarily the case. I think that's a unique insight, where people may view going to the museum as a way to spend their leisurely time. Really, a trip to the museum can be much more than that, in terms of addressing one's mental health or developing connection with a family member, and something along those lines. Whereas, separating those two out between, well, I have some free time, so I'm going to just go to the art museum. I think that's much different.
Absolutely.
In your perspective, considering some of these things, and seeing sort of the value of the arts, do you feel that there are some ways that people can shift their mindset or actions that they can take to recognize art in their life a little bit more acutely, and so that it can be part of what they're doing, and they can recognize that connection between the arts and other aspects of their life?
Boy, that's a really good question. I don't know that I've got any terribly great insights here, but I think there's at least two things to think about. And one is at sort of like an individual level, and one is at a social level. Um, at the social level, I'm impressed, as I know you are, because you were even alluding to this sort of early on. When we look at the ways that communities have been coping with the current pandemic, one of the things I think a lot of us are struck by are the role that the arts have had to play in that. So whether it's Italians singing to each other across a piazza, whether it's a community, live streaming a tenor's opera performance in an empty cathedral, whether it's people simply, posting videos of songs that they're playing on YouTube and sharing stuff with friends that they found inspirational or funny, or just, anything. So even if we can't be physically close to each other, even if we have to be physically distant for now and probably the foreseeable future, there's certainly ways of being socially connected that the arts are absolutely central to and probably facilitate. But individually, it's probably a good idea. And so this is what I've tried to do individually, is to make sure that I'm sort of finding uses of my time and structuring my day, but in a way that leaves me time to read, that leaves me time to play guitar, that leaves me time to listen to music, that leaves me time to watch movies. Um, and again, not just because these things are a welcome distraction, although I suppose they are, but because I think that just it makes my life better, in when times are well, when we're not fighting a global pandemic. I still would like to be surrounded by music and literature and film and artwork. And so reminding ourselves that those resources are still there and that they're still valuable, and incorporating them into our daily routines and daily lives. And by the way, supporting those mechanisms as much as we can, is a really important thing as well. So both individually and socially, I absolutely think that there's things that we should be doing. Social media is a decent outlet, but there's more creative mechanisms there. as we were talking about, but just an individual commitment to make sure that we include aesthetics in our daily life is going to make us so much better off during incredibly difficult times. You might think a lot of us haven't needed art more than we need it right now.
It is interesting, sir, to hear your description of how you're working to structure your day. I know that a lot of people are working on that right now and adjusting to working from home or having their children at home and trying to develop routine. And it seems like an opportune time to incorporate a moment of art into that and make it part of the routine and not just supplemental.
Absolutely. I do. And I want to be a little careful because I'm in a pretty privileged position. I don't have lots of children in my care. I've got time and space in a home that lets me do exactly these kinds of things. And so I totally get that talking about structuring your day for some people is much more difficult than it is for me. Um, but and some people just don't need the kind of structure I need. I guess I'm just a creature of habit. But the point is that structuring my day like I try to do fills a need for me. And even if not everybody has the same resources, even if not everyone's not in the same privileged position, we all have those same kinds of needs. So some of us are going to have to be more creative insofar as we figure out how to satisfy those needs. But every single one of us has needs that arts and contemplation of the arts can really help facilitate.
Well, Peter, I really appreciate the conversation today and the perspective that you bring into the conversation. I wish you all the best and lots of safety as you stay at home and continue to do creative things.
Lord, thank you so much. I really appreciate your work at the Temple and at the Saginaw Art Museum and in the Saginaw community generally. I look forward to seeing you when the world's not on fire. So all my best to you and yours, and please stay safe.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the Saginaw Art Museum podcast. You can stay connected with the museum through our website and social media channels. We invite you to become a subscriber of this podcast or become a monthly contributor to the show to help us carry out our mission of providing art for all.